Okay, go for it.
All right. So I guess I was going to say that so this migration for me started with a customer who was in higher ed. They're based out of the Northeast. It's an Ivy League school, and they've been with Microsoft for a long time. They've been using Microsoft technologies this whole time, but they were looking to go to the cloud, and they were looking to sort of figure out how can we reduce our footprint in our data centers. It's great that we have all these servers sitting on-prem, but it's getting expensive. It's getting too much to maintain, all these sysadmins that are required, all these backups that are required, disk storage, power, everything's required to keep those things running. Is there a way for us to save money from that perspective as well? So those are some of the initial reasons that help us to come in and say, here's how Microsoft and the cloud can help you with that, with the whole situation. That's just the basic, I guess, premise of why we were there in the first place. But in terms of the actual business case, right? So they were looking to reduce the on-prem server footprint. They need lots and lots of servers. This is a massive school. They have to, I think, if you do staff, faculty, students, roughly about 25,000 people. So that's a lot of people with a lot of data that's being stored on their network. The other issue they were having was the fact that, and I'm sure you guys have seen this in the past, I have my files sitting in file shares, which I can access from my company network, but then I'm never sure where people are storing their files. Is it even the right version? Or am I looking at something that's maybe an older version that somebody put it in some folder? I can't seem to find it. And then if I want to share it with somebody, I had to put it on SharePoint, which is fine, but I have to exchange emails with them, put it in attachments. So it's getting to be a bit of a pain for them. They were trying to see if there's a better way to handle that whole situation. The third reason, which was a big reason for them, was they were seeing major trends in their industry when it came to data breaches. So they were seeing a lot of trends in the sense that sensitive documents were being shared with folks who should not be seeing them, and their intellectual property was being sort of compromised in that sense. And so they were looking for better lockdown controls for their sensitive content. And so they were looking for solutions on-prem or cloud, and so Microsoft was able to help them with a solution that covered that base as well for them. The other big reason was the overall cost of ownership. So they have these files sitting in file servers everywhere, and as you all know in your own experiences, files need to be backed up, right? And they get backed up either every day, every month, and they get shipped off to some location where they're stored for X number of days. And then when you have a problem, you go to this backups and figure out how can I get my data back. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. Either way, people lose data in the process. And so they were concerned about the fact that we have to spend all this money and effort and time to make these things happen. Is there a better way of doing these things? So that was sort of the business case for them to start looking at other options. So initially, the scope of this project especially was the fact that we have close to, like I said, 25,000 users who are already in Office 365. Now, they weren't actually using all the services in Office 365, but they had a subscription. Being in higher ed gave them a lot of discounts when it came to those accounts. And so they had those, about 25,000 of them. But they had close to 100 terabytes of just documents across those users in file shares. And more specifically, these are not team-based file shares, these are personal file shares. So things like if you were putting your document that you want to work on, but you're not ready to share it with the whole team or the whole company, right? These are just personal file shares sitting in their servers, almost 100 terabytes of them. That was a lot of content. So what they were looking for is there a way to somehow automate this whole migration process? I mean, I have lots of people here. I can't keep up with this migration. It has to be automated. I can't have somebody babysit this whole migration the whole time. So they were looking for some kind of automation there. Something else that was really important for them was the fact that they wanted to keep their end users in the loop during the whole migration phase, in the sense that they were really looking at about 4 sets of emails that went out for each individual user. One being the T-14 days, when you have 2 weeks heads up saying, hey, the migration is about to happen. You'll be sent an email with some instructions on how you can learn more about what is OneDrive for Business and what does it mean for you, how do you access them, and how do you back up your files currently, how do you make sure that you can access it in the new way. Those just highly generic instructions for them. That's in the T-14 emails. Then they had a T-1 email, which was essentially, this is the day before the migration. It's about to happen. Here's a heads up. Please stop updating your files. You can still access them, but we ask you not to update them, modify them, things like that. Then there was a T+1 email the day after the migration. Migration has been successful. Everything is good. Please take a look and let us know if you have any questions. And then the final one, which was a T+14, which is everything's been good. It's been 2 weeks. You haven't had any complaints. We'll be taking away those file shares from you. So 4 sets of emails. When we first approached them about this whole process, their process to send those emails was to do mail merges. And in my head, I was trying to think 25,000 users who will be getting customized emails through mail merges. Anybody want to venture a guess how long that would take for them to do that? I asked the question to the customer and they were like, we don't have any other options. That was their answer. So I said, let's look at it if you don't mind. We can try and come up with a possible better solution. And they said, don't spend too much time, but if you can do that, if you can automate it somehow, that'd be great. I said, happy to look into it. So this was just their current state, which is they were looking to move all this content. Oh, there was also the whole time crunch. So this project started in February, but they were looking to get it done before June. 100 terabytes data from your on-prem servers to the cloud in about 3.5 months. So we looked at several options. We looked at they were a big Microsoft shop, but they also had a whole Google suite of tools. So they were using Google Mail internally. They were using Dropbox for their file storage. They were using Box for their file storage. They were using file shares for their file storage. So they were sort of all over the place with different options and different tools and different components. But they all sort of agreed that there was a lot of financial sense in just trying to consolidate everything into Office 365 for personal file storage. So we looked at, obviously, in terms of migration tools, we obviously have OneDrive. For migration tools, we looked at Metalogix, we looked at ShareGate, we looked at AppPoint, we also looked at BitTitan, which is another tool in the market for doing these migrations from file shares to Office 365. But we ended up going with ShareGate for 2 reasons. This tool, as you guys know, it's pretty cost effective in the sense that unlike other tools, it's licensed per user who runs the migration. So in case if you have one IT administrator, you essentially get 1 license and you can migrate unlimited content. There's no limit on how much you move. It's just a matter of how many people are running it. Essentially, is how they try to license you. And so from that perspective, the customer agreed that it's a low-cost solution, low investment, but high value. So high return of investment. So that was huge for them. Obviously, there was SharePoint involved in the sense that they were looking to essentially track these migrations so that they can provide some kind of reporting to higher ups in the organization. And so we figured if there's a way to track it somehow in SharePoint and then create some kind of a report that can be shared with executives, that would be a good enough way to get them a status of what's going on. So we tried to keep it in SharePoint. But the big thing that we did from an email automation standpoint was we actually used this thing called Microsoft Flow. How many of you are familiar with Flow in Office 365? Most of you? Perfect. I won't go too much into it. I'll show the actual demo of how we did it for them, but they were not aware of Flow as much. They'd heard about it, but they didn't really know the use cases for it. So this really helped out massively for them. And I'll go into that in a bit. So the actual migration process itself. So as you guys know, the migration involves a lot of planning, right? So all the prep work that goes into making sure that your whole process goes pretty smoothly. So what was something that we really started doing was we said, okay, you got 100 terabytes of content. we need to analyze this content. We need to see what you have and how many people are using it and what kind of foldering structure you have. So some of the things we looked for was, at the time, there was a limit in OneDrive where your maximum file size was 2 gigabytes. So that was a big flag for us to see, are there files in your file system that are bigger than 2 gigabytes? And if those are there, then we need to flag those for a separate process of migration, but those won't be handled by our migration tool. The second thing we looked for was files that were in deeply nested folders. So we all love folders. People in IT hate folders. People who are not in IT love folders, as I've seen my experience. And so one of the issues we have is, we have people who have documents in 10 different folder levels, right? They'll go folder after folder after folder, 10 levels deep sometimes, which works fine when you're in a file share environment. But when you're moving to the cloud, that translates to each folder gets its own path in the URL. And so we are sort of constrained by how many paths, how many letters we can have in our URL, right? So if you go 10 levels deep, that cannot be supported. You cannot get to it anymore once it's been migrated. So that becomes a big issue for customers and how you can access your content going forward. So we looked for files that were greater than 3 levels deep, essentially. That was our cutoff point. We worked with the customer and said, this is a good, happy in between where we don't go extreme, no folders, and we don't want to go crazy as well. So let's find something in between. So three levels deep was a good place for us to start. So we started looking at PowerShell scripts that would analyze the content and give us a report, like a CSV file of how many folders we have and how can we try and consolidate some of that. At the time, when we were doing this migration, the limit from OneDrive was that you could have at the most 219 characters in the URL. Why is that an odd number? It's because it's actually 260, but the other characters are already used up by the tenant name, the domain name. So HTTPS, something tenant name, /personal. Microsoft.com, and then /personal, and then the whole thing afterwards. So from that point on, it's essentially 219 characters, which you think is a big number, but when you put folders in there and everything else, file names, that was the other thing we found was file names were like crazy long, like a whole sentence. You would have file names that were things like this underscore needs underscore to underscore be underscore reviewed docx. Literally, that was a file name I found. And so it's a whole sentence that's in a file name. Now that makes it harder for us to move these files and access them going forward. So we look for those kind of patterns. Fortunately, there weren't that many of them, but we noticed that the law department in the university had a whole bunch of those. So we were able to work with them in having them rename some of the file names, so that makes it easier for us for the migration itself. Now, however, I want to say this too, is the new limit for the URL characters is 400 characters. So what that means is it's almost double from 219 to 400. So what it means is if you do have a lot of deep folders, nested folders, you have a bit more leeway in being able to just bring those as is in your OneDrive migration. Any questions so far? And by the way, I want to keep this sort of open, so feel free to interrupt anytime if you have any questions, because this is just a case study. So jump in at any point if you'd like to. Something that was did was obviously 25,000 users. May I got muted somehow. All right. Is it better now? Yes, I see it. Okay, great. Thank you for bringing it up. Oh, no worries. It's all good. All right. So we created those migration waves, and the way you really do it is we have this mass list of all the users. You essentially sort of start tagging them, saying these set of users with that combine up to say 500 gigs of data will get migrated in this wave. And that's how you sort of try and break it up, right? And so what we did was we essentially created CSV files for each of those waves. And I'll give you an example of what those No. This is good. What I'll do is I'll just keep an eye on this. Yeah, I apologize, folks who are on the Skype for Business call. Internet is not being friendly to me today, but I'll keep an eye on it. So good call on that. So there are PowerShell scripts that you can run to provision with OneDrive. I highly recommend you do that ahead of time because the more users you have, the more time it takes to do it. It took us 5 days in this case. Something else that we did, and I do it no matter what, but in this case it really was important. So as you grow as an organization, security becomes a big issue. So I have these people storing my data in the cloud, and I have no control or no oversight into how are they sharing these things. So if I have somebody sharing sensitive documents to somebody's personal Gmail account that they access from their home computers, and for all I know, their home computer has some viruses in it already. Next thing, my content from my organization is now on an unprotected computer, which means it could get hacked and my company could get hacked, and it's a major impact from that point. So this organization that we were working with was very strict about making sure there were enough policies in place to protect the data and that sharing gets disabled or enabled depending on what kind of content is it. And they basically had some classifications like they would literally call it level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and level 5. Level 5 meant for them that they would not put any of that data on any internet connected device. So it has to be on a device that's completely cut off from the network, and it's like highly sensitive stuff, like research stuff in the medical school or any proprietary groundbreaking stuff. But level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4 stuff got stored, and they had appropriate policies, things like share it with external people, or you couldn't download it, things like that. So it was really important from that perspective that we gave their Office 365 administrators access to those OneDrive sites so that they can have that level of oversight, they can run those reports, they can have that control over who's sharing what, and in case somebody leaves the organization, that these administrators can take ownership of that content. Because that's one of the big things we've seen is in large organizations, when people leave, they take the content with them. Even though it's not something that is explicitly called out, we just do it because it's my creation of work for this company, sure, but I want to take this with me to my new place, right? And so companies are becoming more aware of the fact that how can we try and prevent proprietary information from being shared or being taken out? Yes, sir.
Is this a requirement for like DLP type stuff?
It is.
Those types of actions happen?
Yes. So the question was, is this a requirement for doing DLP, for example? So e-discovery is the best use case for this. So if you are somebody files a lawsuit against you, and now you suddenly have to discover content and put a legal hold on it, administrators cannot do it if they don't have access, right? And so that at that point it becomes more of a reactive state where I'm trying to scramble, give myself access, and is it enough to give me all the reports on what's been shared and things like that? So it becomes a problem. So as part of this migration, we had to ahead of time that we have the things in place for any future scenarios.
So granting the access to the global lab doesn't have to happen.
Right.
Collection.
Mm-hmm.
That's a one-time
It's one time
deal, but what do you do going forward then? Or do you have like a recurring sort of sweep of all the sites to assign that?
Basically. So what we did was, great question. So question was, forward on an ongoing basis, do you need to keep doing this essentially? And the answer is yes. Because as you know, people come and go. And so when new people get added, these sites get provisioned. And so what we did was we created like a script, and we created like a task, and we gave it to the customer in the IT department and said, let's schedule this to run every week or every month, depending on how much attrition do you see in your organization. And then based on that, they can take a call because they are involved in when any new employee is onboarded or someone leaves the organization. So as part of that onboarding process, let's run these scripts, make sure they're being done. Or when somebody leaves the organization as well, there are some protocols that need to be followed as well. So yes, this is a one-time thing initially for the migration, but then on an ongoing basis, there are things that have to be done similarly to keep things in place. Great question. So yeah, it's really important from that e-discovery standpoint to make sure that somebody, aside from those users, have access to this content as well. Something else we have also seen as a use case is when employees leave, for example, we try to keep their managers access to those OneDrive sites, and that again becomes like an ad hoc thing where we just have to make sure that the manager of this person who left has access to their OneDrive and things like that. So this script helps from that perspective, in that the IT department also has access to this content when someone leaves. Then what we did was we created a SharePoint site to track these migrations. So, and I'll show you some demos on how I did it, in fact. But the process was we created a SharePoint list, and we populated the list with all the email addresses of every single person who's being migrated. And we basically created some tags for which department are you part of, and what is your migration date, on which date are you being migrated, and which wave are you a part of. And those waves helped us determine what those outage windows had to be. So certain departments, for example, I know their student financial system had some outage windows that were very specific, where they said, we cannot let you do this in those timeframes. It's critical business time for us. And so we had to adjust our schedules around those kind of outage windows, wherein we can make sure that they don't get impacted for their business processes. So this SharePoint site helped us sort of get a holistic view of who's being migrated on what date and those kind of things. So it was really helpful. Then what we did was we basically said, okay, if you can find you a better way to automate those email migrations, that would save you, we estimated about 500-600 hours worth of work across all those users. And so they were just right on board with that. And so I'll show you what I did with the Flow itself, but Flow really was instrumental in basically automating the whole email notification process, wherein we used the SharePoint list as the trigger. So we looked at the migration tracking list and said, when we change those wave statuses, those will trigger sets of emails. And depending on status value, the T-14 would go out, or the T-1, or the T+1, or the T+14. So it was completely automated from that standpoint, and we made sure that the emails were correct with the right formatting. This customer was also very sensitive about the email template that we used. So they've trained their customers on phishing emails, meaning look for phishing emails and know what the difference is between an internal email versus a phishing email. And so we were really careful in making sure that email looked right, HTML based, had the right color schemes, fonts, logos, and we had to one of the things Flow lets you do is send an email as someone else. So we had to set it such that the actual sender is a email address that they're all familiar with. So a lot of things went into that whole discussion, but we were able to do that with Flow very easily. Let's see. So once we did all that, then the question was, okay, so how do we do the migration itself? So the migration essentially meant that with ShareGate, we really had to install the ShareGate client on some computers that ran the migration itself. Now, typically, most customers that I've seen say that I have a lot of servers sitting in my data center. Let's just put ShareGate on one of those and let's run the migration. That's great, but the problem with that is when you move into the cloud, your biggest bottleneck when it comes to speeds of migration come in when you're trying to write data into the cloud. So we were looking at a fixed time frame of 3 months to make this happen. And so in order to maximize our throughput and our efficiency, we recommended that they go with 5 VMs in Azure to basically try and minimize the time it takes to move the content from their on-prem file shares to the cloud. We ran some tests. This customer was highly motivated in learning the right reasons to do something. And so we had to run tests for them to show them if we run a migration from a server sitting in a data center versus something that's in the cloud, what's the speed? We were seeing speeds of close to 7 or 8 gigabytes per hour from a server sitting in their data center. That number jumped to 25 gigabytes an hour when we put it in Azure. So that right there was almost a threefold increase in speed. Yes, Kenny?
How do you get files from on-prem?
No, so the question is, if I understand correctly, how do you connect your Azure VMs to your file shares on premises?
Yeah, you're trying to use ShareGate.
Yes, correct.
All your file shares are local.
Sure.
Right? So
Sure.
getting that data up into those VMs, pushing faster.
Sure. So there are different ways to do that, but the most commonly used way is when somebody has an Azure subscription and they're already using Azure, they've built this internal network. They've extended their internal network into Azure, where you can create secure tunnels of connections between your on-prem systems and your network in Azure. And so there are different ways to do that as well. But these guys had the fastest pipe, if you will, of connections from their on-prem systems to Azure as well. So they already had the infrastructure in place for it. But that made a huge difference because now we're talking about your data getting read from your systems on premises, and the read processes are much faster, and then it's already getting read into Azure, and then you're going from one cloud to another cloud within the Microsoft Cloud infrastructure. And so that alone jumped the speeds almost threefold in terms of how much we could migrate each night for them. So the other thing we ran into was we were trying to maximize that even further, because we're talking about 100 terabytes in the course of 3 months. And so what we recommended was, let's not do just one VM, let's do 5 VMs so we can run these migrations in parallel across 5 different machines using 5 different Active Directory accounts in the cloud. You are paying for 5 different licenses, but look at the comparative costs. So if you look at Metalogix, which is a great tool, they charge you by the gigabyte on how much you move. ShareGate has an unlimited content move. You can move as much as you want. Their base fee, if I understand it correctly, is like $4,500 for 1 user license. 5 user license is $7,500. So in terms of the overall big picture costs, way lower. So we went with a 5 user license, 5 different accounts in the cloud to run those migrations. Obviously, those accounts needed to have the right level of access, but 5 different VMs. It was not a 5-fold increase in speed, but we were moving close to almost 100 gigabytes per hour across those 5 different VMs. It was pretty good. Yes, Kenny? It's all good.
I see a lot of throttling with ShareGate, moving content, those types of things. Was it because you're doing 5 different media accounts and then sees those as separate?
Yep. So the question is, did you get throttled when you're trying to move these files through ShareGate? Yes, we did, but you'll be surprised to know that the throttling for OneDrive doesn't happen as much as it does for SharePoint migrations. So SharePoint migrations go a lot slower and get throttled by us a lot more in the cloud, but OneDrive throttling is not as much. But yes, to your point as well, going with 5 different VMs, 5 different user accounts, helps you bypass some of those throttles that we have in place to ensure that we don't crash our networks. But yeah, that really helped as well. But OneDrive migrations are much faster typically. So we installed ShareGate, we configured unique AD accounts on each of those VMs to connect to the tenant, to move the files itself. And basically at that point, everything is done. The CSV files are in place. We've already identified those files that are bigger than 2 gigabytes. And we told the customer, those files that you have will have to be copied over manually. Meaning you just have to, once OneDrive is configured and you have the client syncing all the content, you just drag and drop. Easy as that. And I created some instructions for how to do it on a Mac, because higher ed had both Mac users, PC users. So screenshots on how you do it, that kind of stuff really helped in moving those files manually. Right. So the question was from Becky that we actually asked users to do it on their own and not automatically. Yes, and that was for 2 reasons. Again, scope, 3 months, make it done. We don't want to spend time doing things that can be done on their own. But secondly, we have seen that when we ask users to do some basic tasks, it helps drive their level of engagement with the product as well. Because now it's not something that's being shoved down their throats, so to speak, that they're actually using it and seeing how it works. So we've seen that when we work with them, things go a lot smoother in migrations. There was no freaking out, but there was some concern as to some users may have issues with being able to do that. And that's why I spent a lot of time, almost 2 weeks, creating documentation with screenshots on Windows, Macs. Even in Windows, there was Windows 7 instructions, Windows 10 instructions. On a Mac, I just said, okay, Mac, Sierra, something, I don't know those names now, but a couple of versions of Mac as well, and how do you do this in a Mac? Because even in a Mac, it's a different screens are available for different versions, and so it's hard for them to know how to do it. So yeah, it was a lot of documentation. And they also had different versions of Office. So, and they had different versions of the OneDrive client. And so we had to sort of create some documentation to say, okay, for this version, here's the link. One of the good things they had was they already had this culture wherein their users knew where to go for help. So they have their own website, internal website, that is very thorough in instructions. And so they already had this mindset of knowing where to go to look for something if they don't have the answers. So all I had to do was create the content and then have somebody publish it on their site. And that really helped in that situation for sure. But yeah, they did it on their own. I mean, 2 gig files. We also had them, if they had folders that were 10 levels deep, for example, it's their job to consolidate. And that was really important for them to do it, because if they know where they're moving it to, then they'll know where to look for it. If I do it for them, they'll be confused as to where did you move it? Did you even move it? If not, where are my files now? So putting some onus on them helped. Good thing for us also was the fact that there weren't that many people who had it outside of the law department. I think their internal law department was just a separate use case for us. But yeah, it was good from that perspective. So basically at that point on, everything is done. We just kick off the migrations and we don't have to babysit the whole process. It's all scripted. It's all being managed in those VMs. We just go in there and every few hours monitor and make sure things are still going okay. We don't see any errors, and just update the list, send out emails, people test, life was good. And so once we were able to establish the speed of the migration, the throughputs, the efficiencies that we did, and the SharePoint tracking list, the emails, those are all the prep work that I had to do. But once those were done, migration was the easy part. Steve.
So in your prep work, you said there's a 1 through 5 grading process for level of sensitivity. for all the documents already graded, or do you have to go through and do any updates to the grading process?
So great question. So your question was, during the prep work for the data classifications, was it already being done prior to the migration, or was it something that had to be done manually during the migration itself? In their case, it was a mixed bag. Some users, some of the content was classified, some wasn't. And so, but they were okay. They understood the fact that going forward, we have to classify it, but whatever is already classified, let's apply those policies in place prior to the migration itself. So if there is level 2 content, making sure that in the cloud, there are enough controls for level 2 content, level 3 content. So making sure those are there prior to the migration. That way, once it's already there, it's being protected by those policies.
So you didn't identify the content that was not tagged?
We didn't. We had the business do it for us. It's because we had business analysts involved in the project, and so that's part of what we wanted them to work on, which is we will do the pieces behind the scenes, but we want them to be the interface for the customers. So you know your customers, you know, and they know their data. So that path, there was no need for us to be there, be involved, unless there was an obstacle that we had to help them overcome. Yes, sir.
When you're structuring this, you have to use people in and trying to remove their files. So you also have to go through doing kind of a name denomination across. You try to have the files before.
Right. So your question is, during the move, if they had to change any file names, the only time we asked them to do that was when those file names were too long. So one of the things I covered, I don't know if you were there for that or not, but it was a section where you have a limit on how many characters you can support, and if we saw and we identified those ahead of time, and so those are the ones we asked them to change. But other than that, we kept it consistent. Correct, we did not. Because what we don't want to do is, this was a big enough change as it is. We don't want to institute any more changes that may not be needed per se. It would be nice to have, but you want to keep it as smooth as possible for them to be able to start using it. I had another customer in Boston that called us because they were using OneDrive quite heavily, and over the weekend they got hit by a ransomware attack. How many of you know what ransomware attacks are? Most of you? Great. So ransomware attacks are essentially like a virus, but what it does is once it hits your computer, it encrypts all your files to the point where you cannot access them anymore, and then you pay a ransom to someone to get the key to get your files back. This customer was already using SharePoint and OneDrive in the cloud, and they got hit by ransomware, and the reason they were impacted was the fact they were syncing content on the computers. So the synced copies of those files were attacked, and then those copies got synced back up to the cloud. And so the situation was, how do you deal with that situation now? And so I had to basically fly in Sunday afternoon when they found out the issue on Saturday afternoon. And so the first thing we told them via email was, we'll give you a script that will block syncing. So let's stop the damage, let's limit the damage on what is getting synced back up to the cloud. So that was the first thing we did, we told them, and then we asked them to just change a setting in the tenant where nobody can actually update content in their OneDrives anymore. So just stop it from that perspective, limit the damage. But then the next issue was people who had their content compromised, how do you get it back? So that's where it was a bit of a challenge, because this organization was, they don't have a culture of dealing with security breaches and things like this. And so they didn't share a lot of this information with their end users about what really happened. So they were trying to sort of keep it under wraps and see if there's a way to get the data back without having to share too much information, make it too intrusive for them. And so at first, I was just trying to struggle to understand, okay, what can we do and what can't we do? Ultimately, what ended up happening was we had to engage our support team to basically have them go back almost 15 days to see what data can we get. The reason for 15 days was after further digging of and asking more questions, we found out that the breach didn't happen on Saturday. It happened almost a week back. And the IT department was trying to keep it under wraps on their own. But when things got out of hand, they escalated to the IT department's heads, who then involved us. And so it wasn't a day's worth of data loss, it's almost 7 days. And they still didn't have a good way of knowing which other devices in the network were compromised. And so they were sort of unsure of how far back it really goes. And so we said, let's go 15 days and see what we can do. And so with 15 days back, we got the data back. We restored it per user. But the problem was each computer had sync client syncing content. And so if we had to do restores, we will restore it back at the cloud level. But the moment we re-enable sync, it's going to look at local copies being newer than what's in the cloud, and it's going to sync back up all the corrupt files. And so finally, we had to engage the customers. And so what we ended up doing was I had to write a VB script, of all things, to go into the registry of the computers and manually set a flag, a configuration that says, unsync everything, unlink your OneDrive client with the cloud completely, disconnect. And then once we restore your content, then you can do a fresh sync of what's in the cloud. But the impact is you will lose your files that you updated in those 15 days. And so that was ultimately what we ended up doing for them. The model of the story being, it's good to put your data in the cloud, but that doesn't guarantee security. That there are other things that you have to be aware of, and basic things like if I see a phishing email that could be a ransomware attack, how do I identify and educate my customers or not to click on those? And if you do click on those, mistakes happen, right? Let's report it right away. Let's create a culture where you can report it openly and not be concerned about what if I get fired for this, things like that. Let's not have that mindset, because then you could have saved this problem. If we had brought us in a day after this happened, the impact would have been a lot lesser. So, something I just wanted to share about OneDrive's. Yes, sir.
I just want to say it was the fact that they actually were storing their data in OneDrive that allowed them to get them.
Exactly. It helped them get it back. Exactly. Yeah. At that point, you're lost, right?
So is that what you ended up doing was restoring?
Yes. So the question was if we had to restore versions. Absolutely. We restored versions, and that was for more of a selective restore. We also have a situation where if you call support, we can actually do bulk restores. Like we can do it at a massive scale of users, because ultimately for us behind the scenes, all your files are in databases. So we can restore those databases, but you have to do it through support. You can't do it through MCS. I don't have the authority to do it.
How far back can you restore?
It depends on your settings, but typically it's like 30 days. You could go up to 60 days actually, up to 60 days, but most commonly it's 30 days. But at that point it's not as valuable, because now your team, your organization has lost so much data. And so the most I've seen is 15 days, in fact. And so that's really it. And it's not easy to get the data back for that level of users. So we have to sort of, MCS has to build a case with support and escalate and say, here's why they have to do it, because we have exhausted every other option. So it's not an easy thing to do, but it can be done. It's the benefit of being in the cloud, but you also have to do other things well to make sure that if things go wrong, you can report it right away and we can come in faster and fix it for you.
So on your original case here, you said before that you did not engage them on their local files and that sort of thing on their machines.
We didn't.
As part of this, though, when you implemented this, did you implement any kind of syncing with their local machines after this?
We did. So
you had to have a part of this where you pushed out the sync line?
So great question. So the question was, once the migrations were done, what did we do with regards to the sync client and syncing of local files? So the customer was using not SCCM, but they were using another tool to manage the software for everybody, not students, of course, that's unmanaged, but staff, faculty, they were being managed devices. And so they pushed the sync client as part of the software system that they had. And we had them include a script that would automate the linking of the accounts with the client. The only thing being, when you open the client, it'll ask you where do you want to sync it to on your local computer. That was the only screen they got. Is once everything's done, I click on OneDrive for Business, I'm automatically logged in. But I had to choose which folders I'm syncing and to what folder on my computer. C drive, that kind of stuff. We had some people who were using Windows 10, and it wasn't that much, but Windows 10 has more integration with OneDrive, where you can sync your local My Documents automatically, or pictures can be synced with OneDrive for Business. And so we said we can't help you with that because it's a small set of users, Windows 10, but we give them instructions on how you would do it.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly the thought process we're going through right now. If we're going to be Windows 10 across the enterprise,
I would look into being able to script it somehow.
Figure out what pieces we want to
So,
sync to OneDrive.
so what I would do is I first start identifying what you want to sync in those local machines, but then look for ways to automate it through scripting. Because people don't like doing it on their own. And so being able to run it on logon, for example, was something we did. And you have a thing on logon, we can say just run once, that we doesn't keep running over and over. And so as long as it ran once, it'll run, and that's it. And so that's how we managed to instruct them on how to do it. Yes, sir.
So did you sync up people's MP3 collections?
No.
Their entire family photo album?
So great question. The question was, did we end up syncing people's MP3 collections and personal pictures? We didn't investigate to that level. No, we did investigate different file types that were being stored, and MP3s came up, MOV, JPEGs, all that stuff came up, but it was not significant. And we made a collective decision, both business and IT and Microsoft, and we said, move it. Just do it. Keep it least intrusive, make it happen in 3 months, then we'll discuss if it gets worse. If it was worse, we would have had to figure out what to do with it. But in this case, it wasn't that bad.
And then the other question would be, anyone exceeds the terabyte quota?
Right, so that was a good question. So we had a lot of people who were getting close already. So in our analysis, we had a lot of users who were already at the 700 gig mark. It was sort of mixed in that even though we had 100 terabytes across 25,000 people, if some had a lot of content, some had very little, like half a meg even. And so we gave a report to IT and said, here are the set of users that we see are already close to the limit. And so we gave them provisions on what you can do. So it's easy for administrators to bump up somebody's storage from 1 terabyte to 2 or even 5. And so we just gave them instructions on how to do it. But it was more of an ad hoc thing. And so they had email notifications for when somebody approached that threshold of 85%. And
I guess the other thing would be, especially in higher ed institutions, they're talking about research files.
yes.
SAS files, SPSS files,
Mhm.
all those things that looking for other access databases that
Yeah.
aren't typically very cloud friendly.
Yeah.
Were there any of those things that you looked at, or you just moved them all up and said, it's up there, it might not work as well, it might not do what you want it to do, but it's up in the cloud now and it's off of our file share kind of thing?
Sure. So question being that did we just move all the files which would have been larger files or databases, did we just move them to the cloud? We made a conscious decision, both IT and business, where we said, would you like us to investigate it further or just move everything? They said, for the sake of time, just do it. Our big decision points though were what I had here, which is, are you more than 2 gigabytes? If so, I'm sorry, I can't move it for you, but you can do it. Sorry. And then the second thing being, how many folders deep? These two are the only major criteria for us in terms of deciding what we move and what we don't move. Special character, same thing, and even that's being addressed. That was a good point. So that was the other thing we looked at. Files that had special characters which were not supported in the past, but are now supported. So that's a great point. I forgot to mention it here. But yeah, if you guys are doing it now, you have a new limit of 10 gigabytes and 400 characters, and you have more special characters. I think only hash signs and ampersand question marks are supported now, I thought. No? I thought they were supported.
2 months ago they weren't.
Okay, then maybe that's a limit. I know they added some new characters that you can support, but maybe that's still in the list. It's not supported.
For early release.
What's that?
That could be for first release customers too.
Right. Okay, so I just want to show you guys really quick some demos of what we actually ended up doing. So if you look at a sample CSV file, I picked it up from Sharegate's website because I couldn't find my screenshots. But Angelina picked. But this is what it would look like essentially. You could run a PowerShell report of your existing file shares and have it look like this essentially, where here's the source path and here's their destination OneDrive URLs. This is very easy to populate based on this. Because if you notice, the pattern is pretty similar. Like you know, in each organization, the pattern for the usernames are first name underscore last name, or last name underscore first name, something along those lines. So you take the names here, put it in here, and start massaging in Excel. Just append all these other tenant names and / personals and things like that. So this was really easy to do once you have the data in a CSV file, and then you start splitting them up based on migration waves, essentially. And so this is what it would look like as the source input for ShareGate to run the migration. Here's a sample script of what the PowerShell script actually does. So it looks at the table in the CSV file, imports it, uses semicolon as a delimiter, and then it basically takes your password for your tenant. So this would be, if I'm the administrator and I'm running the migration, I'm passing my credentials for the tool to connect to OneDrive for Business to move the files on behalf of all these users. And then basically just it's doing a for each individual row in the table.
And the password for your tenant is my password, right?
That's right. In this case, it's a variable, but yes. And then just the destination path of where I'm copying everything into their documents folder in OneDrive for Business. And that was pretty much it. So it's pretty straightforward, simple script. You run it and you just stage it across each of these VMs and it just does its business. It's pretty fast. Here's how the typical output would look like. I just try to make sure I capture errors and some successful ones. Yes, sir.
Let's read back.
Yeah.
PowerShell, is that specific to ShareGate?
Yes. So you're using ShareGate for the migration. So ShareGate has its own PowerShell window, and you would basically just plop the script in there, customize it a bit, tweak it to your needs, and then run it. Forward. So next thing I wanted to show you was, so on the SharePoint side of things, and I know I'm running a little over, so I'll keep it quick. Here's what we did to track everything. Now this is a little basic because I just made it on my demo, but this is essentially what we did for the customer. So we were on the SharePoint site. I made a list called OneDrive migrations. So basically going in here, OneDrive migrations. And the key things we were looking to capture was the user. Oh. And let me zoom in a bit. Right, so the key things we were looking to capture for them was who's the user being migrated, which department they're a part of, what's their migration wave. Now, I also had date for them and a couple other things, but this was all unique for their situation, and the migration status, essentially. And what I ended up doing was, you can't do this in Edge or Chrome, but you would use Internet Explorer and essentially copy the data from the CSV file and import it into this list, and it automatically pops in all those 25,000 people in this list. So it puts things like what's the username, what is their their current file share path, and things like that. It's already there automatically. And
You're using quick edit, or?
not quick edit. You would yes, quick edit. You're right. Yeah, quick edit and then import, but it only works in IE, unfortunately. And once the data is there, you start assigning migration waves, and then you set the statuses. By default, it's set to not started, and then we can change it in quick edit to whatever we're trying to do in the migration process itself.
You said migration wave is primarily by file size? Or by department?
We were doing it, so it was ad hoc. It depended, it depends on the department and their outage windows that were approved. And in some cases, some departments were large enough where they spanned almost a week. And so in those cases, we just broke it down by sizes of migration, so throughputs. So like the fact that I established we could do almost 100 gigabytes per wave per hour. So we would break down our waves in chunks of a few terabytes. And that way we know in this VM, in this wave, we're migrating 2 terabytes for this department, and just does it. And so that's how we decided. But it's a very subjective decision. You can't have one solution that fits everybody's needs. So
Look at the user and capacity.
right, exactly. The next thing we did was with Flow. So as you can see, you have this option here to see your flows. And what we did for them was a pretty unique thing. Now we've started doing this for other customers as well. But this helps with the email notification process. So how many of you are actually using flows on an active basis, on a regular basis? Glenn? So I think Flow is pretty awesome. Because the way I use Flow is if there's something that I like to automate and it's already in this Office 365 landscape, I'll try to do it in Flow first and see if it's doable. Some cases, Flow is not good enough or doesn't do what I'm looking for it to do, and I just move on to something else. But the good thing with Flow is it does a lot of things that you think you shouldn't be able to do, but you can do it now. And so it just, for me, it's like, that's my number one thing I try. If this doesn't work, then I look at other options. But in this case, this was a very specific one. And so if I click on Edit Flow, very basic. So what I do is I connected my flow. Every flow works based on specific triggers, any event that has to happen first to trigger this flow to run. And so in my case, the trigger I used was when an item in this list is being created or modified. So what happens is when it gets created or modified, it is looking for migration status. The field is equal to send T-10 email. So if the status here for any of them, I can do a quick edit here to show you how it would typically happen, is you pick one and then you say, I want it to be send T-10 and I want to do it for the whole wave. So I can just kind of like Excel, just take this bottom right corner and just drag it down and then hit done. And that's how I would change statuses in bulk. And essentially what will happen is once this happens, it'll go into Flow here and say, okay, if this criteria is met, if yes, send an email. And so what it does is it looks at the to field to be the email address of the user that's assigned here. So it automatically knows the email address of this person and sends this person an email with this body. And so it says this is the subject, your personal files are, I just made this up, are scheduled to be migrated soon. Hello, display name. So it says it's somewhat unique in the sense it looks at hello person's name. And then you're receiving this email, it's full HTML. So you get good branding on those emails as well. And then you can do CCs, blind carbon copies. You can do send as, like I said. You can look at specific email addresses. I'll zoom this up a bit. And then going further down, I can set the importance of this email to be high. So it shows up as an exclamation point and flag in your inbox. Is HTML yes? And once that's done, I will say once the email has been successfully sent, it's going to update the status here to say T-10 emails sent. And usually it runs really quickly. So let's see if the status changed here. Sure enough, the status now says T-10 emails sent. So from a reporting standpoint, it means I know I can tell my higher ups for wave 1, those emails have been sent out. Now we are waiting for the actual migration date. So we can send a T-1, then do the migration and T+1. So, and I basically did an iteration where I said, okay, if it's T-1, this T-10, this is the process. If this value is not t minus 10, then it looks for t minus 1. And again, is it looking for t minus 1? Yes. If yes, same thing, send an email, update. If no, then look for t plus 1. Again, same thing, is it t plus 1? Yes, send the email. If no, look for t plus 10. And if yes, send an email, update the item, that's it. So this was the piece for the automation of email notifications and tracking and reporting for higher-ups, so that they can, now I don't have it here in my demo, but we created a Power BI report as well based on the data in this list. And so higher-ups could see where are we with the migrations, how many have we moved so far, how many more are left, are we on track, that kind of thing. So pretty basic from that perspective, but we moved 100 terabytes in 3 months. It was a lot of work, and the Azure bill went up pretty high for them. But in the overall scheme of things, here's the big thing for them. So this higher ed institution was looking to go to the cloud more and be less on-prem. And they were also, with this model, saving close to $110,000 per department per year by going to OneDrive for Business, because they were consolidating their data centers, so no more leases on those, no more costs with maintaining servers, disks, power, everything. So $110,000 a year per department was being saved with this solution. So they saw it as an investment worth making long term. And then we created some security policies for them in the cloud on ensuring that certain types of data don't get shared and externally, for example, and so give them a more end-to-end solution. So where they were with file shares to where they are now, major upgrade. So I would look at your system to see if you guys have file shares, for example. That's the best place I would start looking. Personal user-based shares. If you have those, which I know a lot of people do, you should look at OneDrive for Business.
When you upgraded, were you able to maintain the created date, modified date,
Yes.
and the owner?
Yes, good question. So we were able to retain that information, who created it, when it was created, modified, owner. Now, some of those had shared their files using Windows file shares. We didn't bring those along, obviously. But we showed them the new ways of sharing things in OneDrive for Business. So one of the things I like, and I know, Ben, you may see this as a use case, is in OneDrive, you can actually share your OneDrive files with people outside your organization, which when you're dealing with your customers, that's a very good, safe way of sharing something. But one thing I would look at is when you're sharing those links out for the documents, that you put an expiry date on those links. So they expire after a certain time, so that then it's like, okay, those links won't work.
Instead of just sending a copy to them.
Sending a copy, or sometimes when you send those links work forever. So if they forward it to somebody else, or something like that happen, or the emails get compromised, anybody can get to those documents. And those could have SSN numbers, other things that you wouldn't want to share. So those basic level of things you can very easily do with OneDrive, and I can show you later too. Questions, comments?
The classified documents, those are the document that's more has more sensitivity. We create, so in OneDrive Business, are those, how do you manage those? Are the client?
So I had given a talk on this a few months ago on security and compliance in the cloud. I covered it there, but I'll show you real quick. You may find that on, I think I put it somewhere. I'll look for it. So actually, let me show you. It's not here. Okay. So when you're here, I'll go to the admin tenant real quick. So what you do is, if you're an administrator in your tenant, you will essentially first start by going into security and compliance. So the question which was asked was, once you have everything in the cloud, how do you create those security controls to keep your content safe and secure? And so once you're here, you have these classifications. So you start by creating labels, which I don't want to go into too much detail here. It's in my talk, and like I can show you where it is. But you create these labels over here, the classifications, level 1, level 2, level 3, that kind of stuff. And then what you do is the policies on those. So for example, if I have level 3, what does this policy do? So this policy is applied across all locations. So Exchange, emails, groups, OneDrive, and SharePoint. And then policy settings. Basically, I'm not doing it here. Then you go into data loss prevention, and you tie the policies to those labels. So the way it would work, in fact, I can show you how we do it internally at Microsoft. If I can pull up a document. This is not a good example. Let me try another one. So the way labels work is you create them in Office 365, and then if you're using Office Pro Plus as part of your subscription, those labels get pushed down to your clients, to your Exchange Outlook client, to your Word client, and you can essentially start labeling tagging your documents as labels from within your Office client itself.
The labels in the Office client is in options.
So it's a combination of Azure Information Protection, but it's basically like a bar that sits on top, like a yellow bar, and it'll have different labels on it. And so you can just tag it. You can just click on it. It assigns that label. You'll have a default label like level 1 or something more generic. But let me see if I can find a better example of this.
That is, you said it's the Office Pro Plus.
Office Pro Plus. Okay, here we go. So here I am in Exchange, in Outlook, right? I have this tab here called Protect. These are all my labels. But here's another one, right here. Non-business, public, general, confidential, or highly confidential. So this essentially comes across in every Office client, Excel, PowerPoint, Visio, Word, Outlook. It's just there, and you can start tagging it here. It stores it in your OneDrives, and policies are being assigned to it automatically behind the scenes. You don't have to do a thing. All you do is just right here, once. So, well, this is there by default across the board. I didn't do anything to it, but you also have a tab here called Protect. That does the same thing.
And that happens because you're using OneDrive for Business?
Well, OneDrive Business, and I've created those labels, and I'm using Azure Information Protection, which is another component of Office 365. It's just some pre-configuration that you do, but once it's done once, it's very easy for someone to consume and start using on a daily basis. So. Any other questions? One thing I'll say about Flow is when you're doing this, there is a limit of how many flows you can run. So each time I add a new entry in this list, which triggers a flow, each execution of flow is what we call a flow run. And in Office 365, you're allowed 2,000 flow runs per user per month. That's the limit. Now, having said that, let's say your organization has 1,000 employees. So essentially, you get 2,000 times 1,000 flow runs across your whole tenant. That big number. So while there is a limit per user, there's a bigger limit as well. And the reason I say the bigger limit is if you're doing something like this, you don't have to worry about the 2000 limit because you can still run it as a single user and try not to exceed that big limit. The only problem being you will use up all those flow runs, which means nobody else can use flow runs for that month. Am I making sense? It was something even I didn't know at the time, but then I had to call the product group and they had explained to me how flow runs are being calculated and what limits are being enforced. You can actually buy it on your own. You can buy it like $40, I think. That gives you another 50,000 flow runs. So it's pretty cheap in that sense. But 200,000 flow runs. Let's see if you have 1,000 users. So 2 million, in fact, 2 million flow runs per month is a big number. So you shouldn't even have to pay for anything.
I'm sure that you create that flow under your admin account.
Yes, good point. So yes and no. It is recommended that you create the flow using some kind of an admin account, like a shared service account. That way your IT administrators can all log in using that account and administer this flow. But the other thing that we added, I want to say in the last year or so, is team-based flows where you can actually share this with others. And so I may have created this, but I can share it with other administrators in my department. So you could do it both ways.
Even more important than having, let's say, the administrative owner, if you're creating your own, you want to promote it, if you add a second owner that's an administrator or any other person, it automatically becomes a team flow.
Right.
That's not the big feature. The big feature is within your workflow itself, within the flow, different actions, you can actually now set what user account you want it to run under.
Right.
So, and what you do is you set up connections that time. So like, I can go in and create a workflow for sending notifications to people as part of an approval process, but I don't want it to come from G. Goldberg. I want it to come from service at Sensor.
Right. And that's how you would do it over here. You're absolutely right.
Under
The send as. So the send as field is where it will run as the other exchange.
Go to the ellipses at the top of the action. So the send as will populate your send as field, but up here.
Run after.
Connections. This is where you can have you can predefine what your service accounts
That's true.
be. The only caveat with that is to make sure that that account you're going to run has the appropriate license for what you're trying to do. So like if you're going to access a database or a SharePoint site, that account service account better have read or write access to it. Or if you're going to send notifications, and you can have different actions that have different connections within that workflow. But you better make sure if it's going to send notification that it has at least an Exchange One or whatever it is licensed with it, so it has the ability to send emails. It has to be provisioned, in other words. Service accounts are plugged that way.
Right.
Ajay, do you mind just recapping that real quickly?
Oh yeah, so essentially, actually I don't know if I can recap everything that Glenn just said, but just to summarize, I think so I guess what Glenn was saying is you have multiple options in how you can configure flows to run as different accounts, wherein you can go within flow and create your own separate connections for each action and have those actions execute as a different account, as long as that account has appropriate licenses and that it has the appropriate level of access to those data behind the scenes that it's trying to access and work on. Something else I just want to quickly cover is things you can do with Flow. So don't think of Flow to be just things you can do with Microsoft technologies. I had another customer that was using exclusively Gmail for their internal email at the university. And you can actually configure email actions to send as a Gmail account. You can make connections to Oracle systems, SAP, Salesforce. So it's like pretty much anything. Facebook, Twitter.
So this is the difference between this and the SharePoint workflow. Is this replacement or substitute or actually?
So question was, is Flow a replacement for SharePoint Designer workflows in on-prem? The official answer is no, but the unofficial answer is yes, it's heading in that direction. Like a lot of things that you could do in SharePoint Designer workflows, you can do it here for sure, but you have to think of Flow as much more than that, because SharePoint Designer workflows always work in a team-based situation. It's like it's a SharePoint list or something like that. A flow can be you as a user, let's say you have emails that come in with attachments and it's part of a business process, you get invoices from your vendors. You can have a flow that automatically looks at your inbox, and if it gets an email from this sender with an attachment, it'll take the attachment and store it to a SharePoint site automatically. And so that's another use case of flow that you would not have thought of in the past. So flow, the way I see it, is how can I automate my process? It doesn't matter if it's my process or a team-based process. If I can automate it, I'll try it with flow first. And if it doesn't work, then I'll say, okay, I'll just live with it until something else comes along.
That's exactly what I ran into, because on premise, you could have inbound email, and then in the cloud, you can't.
You can't.
have to do it with flow.
Yep.
That was the first use case I had encountered for this.
Yeah, you can't do incoming email in SharePoint Online to a library, right? So, and most companies, they know they have a specific contact in the organization that they send invoices to, payroll department or something along those lines. And so you don't have to change that, just configure flow to run for those kind of emails. And it works really well. So.
And if you don't have a connector out there, there's an API, you can actually build a connector.
Yes, you can.
Host it in Azure, and then you've got your own little widget that you can connect to.
You're right.
Side note, I've got like some kinds where they've got like project sites, it's a repeatable template kind of thing. So we can use globally reusable workflows, the SharePoint Designer, attach it every time these sites created, attach that content type. But flow, it seems like you have to configure it.
Well, you have to. So the question from Becky was, is there a way to create a template and then have it be such that it's attached to a specific list, for example, and that it automatically works the next time you just reuse a template. You don't have to reconfigure from scratch. So what you can do is when you have your own flows, you can submit it to be a template. So submit this template, and then the idea being that it becomes available to your entire organization. So you create a template for flow with its pre-configurations, and so Ben suddenly decides that he can make use of it. So next time when he goes in flow, and he goes in my flows and he goes for different templates, your template will show up there for him.
But there's no way programmatically to attach that, so every one of these sites created using particular templates.
Programmatically, you could do it with what potentially Kenny's going to talk about in the user minutes, where you can use Office PNP to package up these artifacts into a deployable package. It can include flows. We did one for, so we had an internal project. It was not a project, it was more of a fun thing. We called it the Business Productivity Kitchen Cook-Off. It was a competition for nerds in our business area, where they said, here's a make-believe situation. The Ghostbusters have been super successful, but now they're under scrutiny by the government, by the DHS, and they want some oversight as to how many ghost sightings there are. How are you dealing with ghosts? How are you disposing of them? Is this an environmental hazard for us? And so they said use any and all tools you can see in Office 365 to build a solution where you can do that reporting for them, but without hindering the job of the Ghostbusters themselves. And so we were a team of 5. We all had a vision of how we could do it, where all the ghost sightings are being reported by our people using some anonymous forms, using forms, Office 365 forms. They submit the ghost sighting and it automatically picks up their location from the GPS on their phones and submits the data to a SharePoint list. And then the SharePoint list had flows that send emails to specific folks in DHS about a weekly report of ghost sightings and the appropriate steps taken to deal with them. We had classifications in data classifications on different types of ghosts, like big scary ones, like Zool, or the smaller ones. And then we created a Power BI report of a map with those hotspots where ghosts were being sighted. So if we saw a lot of ghosts, specifically in Florida versus Seattle, so those kind of trends were there. So we used Power BI for that. But ultimately, the biggest requirement from the competition was this needs to be a repeatable solution. So the idea being, you did all this for Ghostbusters. Well, guess what? What if now some other, let's say the Justice League wants to do something similar? How will they use it, right? And so one of our developers, super sharp guy, he said, let me see what I can do with Office PNP. So Office PNP, patterns practices, in tandem with SPFX, he was able to take the site template, take all the artifacts of the SharePoint list, the columns, the content types, the data classifications in Security Compliance Center, flows, the Power BI dashboard. He was able to just export all of that and package it as a package file. I don't know how he did it, but he did it, and that was the biggest, and that's why we won the competition, was because we were able to provide a repeatable solution. All you had to do was just deploy the package. And so it deploys things on the fly for you. So you can do it. How? Don't ask me. But I know it can be done. We did it, and that's how it helped us a lot. Oh, and we use OneDrive for the Ghostbusters to store pictures that they didn't want to share with others, that kind of stuff. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm curious, earlier you mentioned the client from box to OneDrive.
Yes, sir.
The process is very different? Or, I know today we're not talking about that, but how do you migrate one box from the client, that client you talk about, one box to
So ShareGate, there are all these tools that do it. I mean, they all do it. ShareGate, Metalogix, AvePoint, BitTitan, they'll go from Google Drive to OneDrive, OneDrive to Google Drive, this back and forth. They all have APIs now for these tools to leverage. It's just that Microsoft, I know, works very closely with Metalogix and ShareGate so that we can give them even more access and knowledge on how to use APIs. Works. The key is doing all the prep work. You do all the prep work, the tools and the migration is the easy part. It's everything else before that is very hard to do, the analysis. Great question. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for showing up, and hopefully you learned something. And if you have questions, oh, actually, I don't know if you guys got my contact information, but if you have any questions, very beginning, you can email me or email Becky. So my email address, Twitter, feel free to email me, and then I'll be happy to help. And when I post this, I will include links for the scripts that I used, both for exporting the file share content, the information in file shares, as well as the actual PowerShell for migrations. All right, thank you so much.